On Monday, May 26, 1973, a group of 9 friends made plans to enter a flooded sinkhole simply known as the Shaft, in what's known as one of the worst diving accidents in the country's history. 8 divers would enter the water for a recreational dive, but only 4 of them would come out. Located in South Australia, Trevor Ashby's farm appears to be a fairly typical farm near Allendale East, an area close to the picturesque city of Mount Gambier. But below the surface, this farm holds a remarkable secret. Many would be stunned to find out the otherworldly sight that's hidden beneath the farm, which was once described as being the closest you can get to venturing into outer space without actually leaving the Earth. The Shaft, a seemingly bottomless pit of water, got its name due to the phenomenon that happens when sunlight shines through the small entrance and strikes the lake, creating an underwater spotlight which illuminates the boulders more than 60 meters below the surface. It's so bright that it easily lights up the entire cavern. Viewed from beneath the surface, this spectacle is unequaled anywhere else in Australia. Due to its uniqueness, it became a very popular diving spot during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The sinkhole was discovered in 1938 as Trevor Ashby's grandfather was plowing the field when suddenly one of his horses seemed to lunge forward and fall. When he went to check what happened, he saw that it had stumbled over a small patch of ground that had given way to a hole that was about 1 foot or 0.3 meters in diameter, which proved to be an opening into a large underwater sinkhole. As he looked down, he could see the water reflecting from the sunlight coming from the hole. The family, not wanting a dangerous sinkhole on their property, along with friends and neighbors, tried to fill it by sending a flurry of heavy stones down the entrance. But after a few days, they realized it was so vast that they had no hope of actually filling it. The hole was later widened to around 3.5 feet or 1 meter in diameter. In the mid-1960s, a local diver climbed down the enlarged opening into the cave's 56-foot or 17-meter wide chamber and made the first descent to a depth of about 69 feet or 21 meters. The cave is one of several in this part of South Australia. The main chamber is about 140 meters long and 80 meters wide. Water level is about 7 meters below the ground, with the hole being considerably wider at this point. Due to the family trying to fill the hole, a rock pile directly under the opening rises to a depth of about 36 meters. A tunnel extends from the northwest to a maximum depth of 80 meters and another to the east reaches an estimated depth of 124 meters. Because of the size of the hole and the height of the drop, divers and equipment are lowered separately into the chamber using a hoist system, with the divers having to put on their gear while already in the water or on a small dry ledge running around one side of the lake. The Shaft is the darkest and deepest recorded sinkhole in the region and is even used by South Australian police water operations to help them practice search and rescue. To this day, the only way to access the huge underwater cave below the surface is through the tiny hole hidden among the grass. As news spread about the Shaft, adventurous divers traveled from afar to visit the cave. Before the disaster, 8,000 dives are estimated to have been made at what soon became known as one of the world's most spectacular diving caves. All it took was a single terrible incident to change the perception of the cave forever. Less than 8 months after 3 divers perished in Allen's Death Cave sinkhole, on May 26, 1973, a group of 9 divers arrived at the location near Allendale East in South Australia with the intention of having a recreational dive at the Shaft. The group consisted of John Bockerman, Peter Burr, brothers Glenn Millett, Stephen Millett, and sister Christine Millett, Larry Reynolds, Gordon Roberts, and Robert Smith, all of which were experienced open water divers. Even at their young age, Glenn and Stephen, like their sister Christine, were qualified open water diving instructors and worked in their dive shop back in Sydney. Robert was also a qualified open water instructor, while the rest of the group had extensive diving experience, but none of the divers had any experience diving caves. While the 8 divers intended to venture into the cave, a 9th member, Joan Harper, had decided she wouldn't be diving that day as she had trouble navigating the ladder down the entrance the day before. The day prior to the dive, the group had signed the guest book at the farmhouse and completed a successful dive at the sinkhole, extending a guideline approximately 150 feet or 46 meters into the water and reaching the primary point of interest known as the rock pile. They briefly explored the perimeter of the rock pile before resurfacing. With their guideline already in place, the group planned to return the next morning to continue exploring the area. The group arrived at the sinkhole on the morning of May 28th after refilling their 72 cubic feet cylinders at Mount Gambier and quickly descended down the shaft. Reports from the surviving divers indicate that they had not planned to explore beyond the edge, a narrow and downward sloping continuation of the cave on one side of the main chamber, far from the natural light provided by the sinkhole's opening. The rock pile was generally considered the boundary for safe recreational diving. The surrounding cavern was dark, relatively unexplored, covered in loose silt and limestone rubble, and continued downwards to depths where the effects of nitrogen narcosis can become extreme, which is why a mix of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen, called trimix, is used when diving in the shaft. The only issue is that trimix wouldn't be developed until 1983. The group were diving on regular compressed air, which meant that even at the depths of the rock pile, the effects of nitrogen narcosis would have been significant, which may have already been impacting the judgment of the divers. On the surface, the 8 divers got into their wetsuits, and around 1 p.m. they climbed down the ladder and entered the lake before swimming to the ledge where they put on the rest of their equipment. They had a brief talk about the intended dive as they donned their single cylinder of air, when they decided not to go deeper than a depth of 60 meters in a region leading to the low, deep tunnel to the northwest of the entrance. Now, having brought their guidelines with them as they feared getting tangled, this was the right call, although things didn't go according to plan. The following events are separate accounts by the 4 surviving divers and were pieced together with the help of former Chief Inspector Wallace Budd to establish a timeline of what happened to the 4 victims inside the cave. The group swam to the perimeter of the rock pile when Robert began to feel strangely ill. His depth gauge read approximately 55 meters. An experienced diver familiar with the symptoms of nitrogen narcosis, Robert signaled to the group that he would be returning to the top of the rock pile. The group acknowledged him but signaled that they were going to continue their descent. Robert began to ascend, but when he reached a depth of 10 meters, he started feeling better. So he decided to descend back down to 40 meters and began circling the rock pile for around 8 minutes until the others returned. Meanwhile, the other 7 divers reached the depth of 57 meters, where the floor almost met the wall. Here they reached the northwest entrance of the cave, where the bottom seemed to drop off. After hesitating for a few seconds, they approached the tunnel. Despite their earlier agreement not to enter the passage, they continued their descent, wanting just a quick look of the cave. As soon as they entered the tunnel, the chamber behind them appeared to be plunged into total darkness. There's some suggestion that this was caused by the arrival of dense clouds over the field above. The divers had been descending for a few minutes when Peter became concerned and swam over to Glenn so that he could see his depth gauge. This showed that they were already deeper than they had planned to go, being at 65 meters, and Glenn swam across to his sister to show her the gauge as well. Christine responded to his signal and did not seem badly affected by nitrogen narcosis, but she then continued to descend even further. Glenn, however, felt that he was close to blacking out, so he stayed at the mouth of the tunnel and waited for the others to turn around. Glenn watched with growing anxiety as the group descended further into the dark tunnel, where they had to totally rely on their small flashlights. At this point, Stephen and John disappeared from the party and were never seen alive again. Back in the chamber, Robert was still circling the rock pile when he saw the flashlight of Glenn returning from the direction the others had gone. Glenn had been monitoring his air and knew he was running out of time. As the rest of the group reached a depth of 68 meters, Gordon turned to Christine and Larry and showed them his decompression meter, indicating that it was time to ascend, as they went far deeper than they had intended to go and didn't want to do a lengthy decompression on their way up. But due to silt being stirred up, visibility became poor as they began their ascent out of the cave, and were stopped when they hit the ceiling of the cave at a depth of around 45 meters, still within the territory of nitrogen narcosis. They began sweeping their flashlights around as they searched for the way out. Gordon raised his arm to the ceiling and shrugged, as though indicating that there was no way out, although Larry stated that he could see that the group looked scared. Previously, when Glenn had begun to head for the surface, he pointed his flashlight behind him as he swam up. Peter, who was below the other 3 in the tunnel and running low on air, briefly saw Glenn's light and turned to follow him. Larry, though, was still stuck on the ceiling of the tunnel with Gordon and Christine, when suddenly his flashlight went out. As he struggled to turn it on again, he descended slightly and almost landed on top of Peter, who had started to swim towards Glenn. Larry was almost out of air too, so he followed Peter, and although he could still see Gordon and Christine, they had ascended into a dome on the roof of the tunnel, which had no exit. He shined his light at them, but could not attract their attention. While swimming back up, Larry looked back down the tunnel and saw another diver swimming very fast, but in the wrong direction further down into the cave. The diver would turn out to be John Bockerman, who was likely under the effects of severe nitrogen narcosis and may have been unaware that he was swimming to his death. The 4th casualty, Stephen Millett, got lost beneath the ceiling of the cave. Compared to the other victims, little is known about Stephen's final moments. At this point, Robert and Glenn resurfaced to find that Larry had already returned from his dive. Half a minute later, after completing a short decompression stop, Peter surfaced with almost no air left in his tank. Both Larry and Peter had to activate their air reserves to make it back to the surface. Glenn, knowing that half the group, including his brother and sister, were critically low on air, asked Joan to lower her unused cylinders. Waiting for Joan to lower the cylinders, Glenn used his last bit of air reserves and descended to a depth of 45 meters but saw nothing. He had no choice but to return to the surface as he was critically low on air and realized that the others would have also run out of air by that time. After the cylinders were finally lowered, Robert donned the fresh cylinders and headed down as soon as Glenn resurfaced. He initially descended to 55 meters to where he had last seen them, but found nothing in the calm water. He then descended to 68 meters where the cliff began to drop off. At the edge, he found Steven's flashlight and camera. He also saw that a significant amount of silt had been disturbed, and that the visibility had been reduced to nearly zero. Robert proceeded to resurface. By the time he resurfaced, an ambulance had arrived at the sinkhole. A last-ditch attempt to find the other divers was made by Peter, who went to the cave for one more look, but after running into the cloud of silt, he too was forced to resurface. By that point, they were aware that they were looking for bodies and not survivors. A search of the cave by the police underwater recovery squad to a depth of 200 feet or 61 meters was initiated on May 29, 1973, the day after the incident. The search was brief and no bodies were found. The team was aware that they were underprepared for such a dive, with the operation being described by Chief Inspector Wallace Budd as the Learn As You Go exercise. A second attempt was made the next day on May 30th, which again proved unsuccessful. The police search will ultimately be postponed as the team sought naval expertise on the dive, and similar to what happened in the famous Plura Cave incident, they recruited 2 of the survivors to be trained for the recovery, the training for which was expected to take several months. The following January, the landowners permitted a television crew making a documentary on diving safety in the lower southeast to enter the sinkhole. On January 22, 1974, after several days of diving in other caves in the area, the crew entered the shaft and descended to a depth of 50 feet or 15 meters, and using professional lighting equipment illuminated the cave like daylight. A technician looking into the direction of his 2 teammates noticed what appeared to be a third person behind them. Further inspection revealed that it was a motionless body in a wetsuit. The team turned the light away and immediately resurfaced to report the body. According to the crew, the body was not filmed. On the morning of January 23, 1974, police arrived at the sinkhole and dove to the location, where they found the body floating under a ledge against the sloped cave ceiling. The body was immediately taken out of the cave, and police divers continued searching to a depth of 55 meters, finding nothing else. The body was only identifiable by the equipment it was wearing, with the official identification requiring dental records. The body was found to be that of Stephen Millett. The landowners, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the remaining 3 bodies stuck on their property, approached an amateur diving team from Melbourne to begin recovery efforts. However, the police diving team was finalizing their training around the same time. On March 9, 1974, RG Trainer and a team of divers entered the shaft. At a depth of 185 feet or 56 meters, Turner saw a body below him laying on its back. On further examination, he found the second body directly beneath it. These were the bodies of Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts. 20 feet or 6 meters deeper, Turner also located the body of John Bockerman beneath a rock ledge. He attempted to move the body into a more easily recoverable position, but abandoned the efforts knowing he didn't have enough air for this task. The next day, the divers attempted to return and recover the bodies, but once again failed, and the effort was called off after a storm left the water too murky. Several more dives were attempted, but the bodies could not be relocated. Finally, on March 11th, the 3rd day of diving, the bodies were found, and Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts were recovered from a depth of 195 feet or 61 meters. Attempts were made to recover John's body from a depth of 115 feet or 66 meters the following morning, but the divers aborted the recovery because of the onset of severe nitrogen narcosis. The divers were sent home for a month to recover from the extended efforts and to do further training for the final recovery, which was the most challenging because of its extreme depth and the position of the body. After making a number of special practice deep dives, the final dive plan included 1 day of diving to secure the location of the body using a guideline, a rest day for the divers to recover from potential narcosis effects, and a 3rd day to recover the body. The divers experienced significant narcosis during both days of diving, but their improved equipment and procedures ensured that the operation went as planned, and John's body was recovered from the cave on April 9, 1974, 11 months and 11 days after the accident. The cause of death in all 4 divers was found to be the obvious lack of air with terminal drowning. Following the accident, Robert Smith stated that on the initial dive he experienced severe nitrogen narcosis at 180 feet or 55 meters, but experienced no narcosis effects after grabbing a spare tank and returning to search for the others. He also claimed to be experienced at depths of 300 feet or 91 meters on regular compressed air without experiencing notable narcosis effects. He stated that the local dive shop had filled their scuba cylinders with bad air, and that it was the air and not just the depth of the dive that had caused the tragedy. The tank he took on the first dive had been filled at Mount Gambier, while the spare tank for the second dive to search for the missing divers had been filled back in Sydney. An expert in dive medicine, Dr. Kant, was consulted regarding the accident and specifically tasked with the examination of the cylinders recovered from Smith and the rest of the party. After extensive examination on the contents of the recovered cylinders, he concluded that the allegations of impure air were entirely without foundation. Dr. Kent had expressed an opinion that the group had neglected a number of safety measures in the planning and execution of the dive, and that these factors and not bad air ultimately led to the accident inside the cave. In the autopsy of Stephen Millett, 4 possible modes of fatal injury were considered. The first was air embolism, a consequence of long overpressure injury usually due to a rapid ascent while holding your breath. The second was lung barrel trauma, although the evidence of this would no longer have been detectable after such a long period of time. The third was death as a consequence of breathing contaminated air, which was ruled out through the examination of the air remaining in the cylinders and the lack of evidence of carbon monoxide in tissue samples. The fourth was the obvious case of death by drowning, which was supported by the evidence of diatom residue in the lung tissue, indicating that there had been water entry before or possibly after death. Along with the contamination theory, air embolism was also found to be unlikely from the accounts of the survivors. The coroner, Special Magistrate R.F. Stokes, concluded that the 4 divers overstayed their bottom time, ran out of air, and died of hypoxia. A further finding was that although all the divers claimed to be experienced and 4 of them were open water diving instructors, none of them were experienced sinkhole, cavern, or cave divers, and that no appropriate safety precautions had been taken, referring specifically to the lack of guidelines, staged deco cylinders, and irrecognizable safety systems such as the buddy system, and that no one had the clear responsibility for planning the dive and safety of the group. After the coroner's scathing verdict on the group's lack of precautionary measures, Chief Inspector Wallace Budd wrote that our natural curiosity means that their death in the shaft wouldn't be the last. He said the grim fact remains that 4 intrepid young people died in their prime while pursuing one goal: exploring the perimeter of the shaft's vast floor and the surrounding piles of stones. Unfortunately, her old story is of adventures gone wrong. As long as the human race holds out and goes hand in hand with the goddess curiosity, the story will have many sequels. As a result of the public outcry that followed, the drowning sparked the formation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia, which sought to self-regulate cave diving instead of having it banned. To this day, the ramifications of the incident can still be felt. Any potential divers to the shaft have to be fully certified by the CDAA in order to ask for permission to attempt to dive into the shaft. While much fewer people are attempting a plunge into the clear but ominous waters of the shaft, it's still considered one of the most dangerous underwater caves in the world. Thank you for watching.